Are you my dad? A child's question spoken live on air became more powerful than any press release, because it shattered a carefully built life and gave it an entirely new meaning. Emily Carter switched off the television the instant the interview ended, as if leaving the screen on for even a second longer might expose the fragile world she had spent years protecting. The living room fell into sudden silence, broken only by distant laughter drifting in through the open window. Outside, the late afternoon sun bathed the small backyard in warm light, where two identical boys chased each other across the grass, their blonde hair catching the sunlight as they ran. Watching them always filled her with equal parts love and unease, because their existence was both her greatest joy and her most carefully guarded secret. She leaned her forehead lightly against the cool glass of the window, her reflection staring back at her with tired blue eyes that carried more history than her 32 years suggested. 4 years had passed since she had walked away from a life that once promised security and admiration, choosing instead uncertainty and solitude. She had learned how to be strong in ways she never expected, measuring time not in achievements or recognition, but in bedtime stories, scraped knees, and whispered reassurances during restless nights. Yet even now, the past had a way of resurfacing without warning, usually wearing the face of the man she had just seen on television. Alexander Reed had looked exactly as the world expected him to look, confident, composed, and impeccably dressed, with blonde hair neatly styled and blue eyes that reflected control rather than vulnerability. He spoke effortlessly about innovation, charity, and progress, his voice steady and persuasive as cameras captured every practiced smile. To millions, he was an image of success and certainty, a man who seemed to have mastered life itself. To Emily, he was a memory filled with unfinished sentences and decisions that had altered everything. She closed her eyes briefly, recalling how she once believed his ambition was a temporary phase rather than a permanent priority. Back then, she had imagined a future that balanced love with aspiration, never realizing that balance was something Alex did not know how to maintain. The man on the screen now was not cruel, but he was distant in a way that left little room for anyone who needed more than promises and delayed time. Turning off the television had been an instinctive act of self-preservation, a reminder that her life no longer revolved around his achievements. A sudden shout from the yard drew her attention back to the present. The boys had paused their game and were examining something in the grass with intense concentration, arguing quietly over who had found it first. Emily smiled despite herself, their identical expressions mirroring each other so perfectly that strangers often mistook them for reflections. She had grown accustomed to the questions their resemblance provoked, and even more accustomed to the careful answers she provided in return. Still, moments like this made the truth feel heavier. The boys carried more than her features and laughter. They carried a connection to a man who had no idea they existed. Emily wrapped her arms around herself, torn between the relief of secrecy and the weight of what it cost. For 4 years she had believed silence was the safest choice, the only way to protect her children from disappointment. As she watched them run again, carefree and unaware, she whispered a quiet promise to the room around her, reassuring herself that she had done what she believed was right, even if the echo of the past refused to fade completely. 4 years earlier, Emily had walked away from a life that looked perfect from the outside, carrying only a small suitcase and a certainty she could barely explain even to herself. The decision had not come after a dramatic argument or a sudden betrayal, but after a long accumulation of quiet disappointments that settled heavily in her chest. Alexander was never unkind, yet his attention was always divided, his mind perpetually several steps ahead of the present moment. Conversations were interrupted by phone calls, dinners postponed for meetings, and plans reshaped to fit opportunities that could not wait. Emily told herself for a long time that this was temporary, that success would eventually make room for everything else. The realization that it would not came slowly and painfully. She remembered standing beside him at a charity event, watching him speak passionately about responsibility and future generations, while she felt increasingly invisible at his side. That night, she understood that loving him meant constantly adjusting her expectations downward, and that frightened her more than the idea of being alone. When she left, she did not leave a letter or an explanation, because she feared words would weaken her resolve. She simply stepped out of the life they had built together, believing distance would make the truth easier to bear. The discovery of her pregnancy came weeks later, in a quiet apartment that felt too empty for the weight of the news. Emily stared at the test for a long time, her hands trembling as fear and wonder intertwined in ways she had never known before. When the doctor confirmed not only the pregnancy but the presence of twins, the room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the world itself were adjusting to the magnitude of the change. 2 lives, both depending entirely on her, altered every assumption she had about strength and sacrifice. She considered telling Alexander, replaying imagined conversations where he reacted with shock, disbelief, or perhaps a sense of obligation rather than joy. The more she imagined those possibilities, the more certain she became that she could not risk exposing her children to uncertainty. She remembered his words from countless late nights about timing, readiness, and focus, and she feared that fatherhood would be framed as an interruption rather than a blessing. Protecting her children became her defining purpose, even before they were born. The months that followed demanded resilience she did not know she possessed. Emily learned how to navigate doctor appointments alone, how to budget carefully, and how to confront her fears without relying on anyone else's reassurance. There were moments when loneliness crept in unexpectedly, especially during quiet evenings when exhaustion made her vulnerable to doubt. Yet each time she placed her hands over her growing belly, she felt a renewed determination to build a life rooted in presence rather than promise. By the time the twins were born, Emily no longer questioned her decision. Holding them for the first time, she felt an overwhelming sense of clarity and responsibility that eclipsed every lingering fear. Their identical faces, peaceful and unaware, seemed to confirm that her path, though difficult, was necessary. She named them Lucas and Noah, silently vowing that they would grow up surrounded by honesty, stability, and unconditional love. In that moment, the past receded into something distant, and the future, though uncertain, belonged fully to the 3 of them. Life with 2 small children quickly reshaped Emily's sense of time, dividing her days into moments measured by laughter, exhaustion, and quiet victories that no one else witnessed. Lucas and Noah grew side by side, their blonde hair and blue eyes so alike that even Emily sometimes paused before calling one of them by name. Strangers often assumed they were mirror images with identical personalities, yet she saw the subtle differences that made each of them unmistakably himself. Lucas observed the world carefully, as though weighing each step before taking it, while Noah moved through life with fearless curiosity, trusting that everything would work out as long as he kept moving forward. Their small house filled with motion and sound as the boys learned to speak, to argue, and to comfort one another without being asked. They developed their own quiet language, exchanging looks and gestures that excluded everyone else, including their mother, from their private universe. Emily watched them with a mixture of pride and awe, aware that their bond would be a constant long after her own role inevitably shifted. Raising twins demanded relentless energy, yet it also provided her with a sense of purpose that anchored her when doubts surfaced. Questions about their father emerged gradually rather than suddenly. At first, the boys noticed other children being picked up from preschool by men who looked proud and distracted at the same time. Lucas asked fewer questions, content to listen, while Noah absorbed every detail and returned home with stories that lingered in his thoughts. One quiet evening, as Emily tucked them into bed, Noah finally voiced the question she had been preparing for since the day they were born. He asked why other families looked different from theirs, his tone curious rather than accusing. Emily sat between their beds, choosing her words with care because she understood how deeply first explanations could shape understanding. She told them that their father existed, that he was real, and that he simply did not know about them yet. The truth felt heavy in her mouth, but she refused to replace it with a lie that might one day fracture their trust. Lucas listened silently, processing the information with the seriousness that often surprised adults, while Noah's eyes lit up with immediate interest, already imagining what this unseen person might be like. From that moment on, the idea of their father became a quiet presence in the household, unspoken yet persistent. Noah asked what he looked like, whether he liked the ocean, and if he laughed loudly or softly, while Lucas preferred to observe Emily's reactions, sensing the complexity beneath her calm exterior. She answered what she could without embellishment, careful not to create expectations she could not control. The balance between honesty and protection became more delicate with each passing month. Emily often found herself watching the boys as they slept, struck by how much of their future remained unknown. She wondered whether silence was still the right choice, even as she feared the disruption truth might bring. For now, she held firmly to the life she had built, determined to give them stability, affection, and confidence before anything else. The question of their father lingered like an unfinished sentence, waiting for a moment that Emily could neither predict nor prevent, even as the boys grew closer to discovering answers on their own. The day began like many others, quietly and without warning, as if it had no intention of changing anything at all. Emily prepared breakfast while the boys sat at the kitchen table, arguing softly over which cartoon to watch, their identical voices overlapping in familiar rhythm. The morning sun spilled across the floor, illuminating a life built on routine and careful balance. Nothing in those early hours suggested that the fragile order she had protected for 4 years was about to fracture in the most public way imaginable. Across the city, Alexander stood behind a polished podium in a modern conference hall filled with journalists, cameras, and bright studio lights. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation as producers counted down the seconds before going live. He adjusted his cufflinks with practiced calm, his expression composed and confident, the image of a man who thrived under scrutiny. This press conference marked the launch of a new philanthropic initiative, one designed to strengthen his public image while addressing issues he spoke about with convincing passion. For Alexander, public appearances were performances refined through years of repetition, each gesture carefully controlled. The broadcast began smoothly. Questions flowed predictably, touching on funding, innovation, and future plans. Alexander answered with ease, his blue eyes focused and assured, his voice steady enough to inspire confidence in those watching. In the control room, producers smiled, satisfied with the direction of the live segment. Toward the end, the host announced that they would take a call from the audience, a feature meant to humanize the broadcast and engage viewers. In Emily's living room, the television played quietly in the background as the boys colored on the floor. She had not intended to watch the press conference, yet the familiar sound of Alexander's voice pulled her attention toward the screen against her will. She froze when she saw him standing there, larger than life, speaking with certainty about responsibility and the future. A feeling of unease crept into her chest, though she could not have explained why. When the host invited the caller to introduce himself, a small, clear voice filled the room. "My name is Noah. I'm 4 years old." The audience laughed warmly, charmed by the innocence of the interruption. Emily's heart skipped violently, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. She turned sharply toward the boys, who were still playing, unaware that the room had grown unbearably still. On the screen, Alexander smiled politely, expecting a harmless question. That smile vanished when the child continued speaking. "Are you my dad?" The words landed without hesitation, simple and direct, carrying no understanding of their impact. In the studio, silence spread instantly, swallowing the laughter and replacing it with stunned disbelief. Cameras held their positions, capturing every flicker of confusion that crossed Alexander's face. Emily rushed toward Noah, her hands shaking as she reached for the phone he held, but the damage was already done. Her breath caught as she realized that a moment she had spent years avoiding had arrived without permission, without preparation, and in front of millions of people. On the television, Alexander stared ahead, no longer addressing an audience but confronting a truth he had never imagined. The world seemed to narrow to that single exchange, as though everything else had faded into irrelevance. In one unguarded moment, a child's curiosity had torn through 4 years of silence. Emily pulled Noah into her arms, holding both boys tightly as the broadcast descended into chaos. knowing with devastating clarity that nothing would ever return to the way it had been before. The silence that followed the child's question seemed to stretch endlessly, heavy enough to press against every corner of the studio and every living room where the broadcast continued uninterrupted. Alexander felt as though the air had been pulled from his lungs, leaving him standing behind the podium with no prepared response, no script to follow, and no way to regain the composure he had spent years perfecting. His mind raced through explanations and denials, yet none of them aligned with the certainty he felt in that moment, an instinctive recognition he could neither explain nor ignore. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, his voice slower and lower than before, stripped of its usual confidence. He asked who was with the child, choosing his words carefully as if precision might somehow contain the damage already done. When Noah answered that his brother and his mother were nearby and mentioned that she was crying, a visible shift rippled across Alexander's expression. The cameras captured the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his blue eyes darkened with shock and dawning comprehension. In Emily's living room, chaos erupted quietly rather than loudly. She had managed to pull the phone from Noah's small hand, but the call had already been disconnected by the producers. Her hands trembled as she set the device down, and she dropped to her knees between the boys, wrapping her arms around them with desperate protectiveness. Noah looked confused but not frightened, while Lucas studied her face intently, sensing the gravity of what had just occurred even if he did not fully understand it. Back in the studio, producers scrambled to regain control, cutting to commercial with hurried apologies, yet the damage could not be erased. Alexander remained seated, staring at the darkened monitor in front of him as whispers filled the room. Advisors leaned in, speaking urgently about public relations strategies, potential legal implications, and immediate damage control. Their voices blurred together, because his attention had narrowed to a single, inescapable realization. Somewhere out there were two children who believed he might be their father. As the broadcast ended, his phone began vibrating incessantly with messages from board members, journalists, and acquaintances demanding explanations. For the first time in his career, Alexander ignored them all. He felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, not driven by fear of scandal, but by the sudden awareness of a life he might have missed entirely. Memories of Emily surfaced with unsettling clarity, moments he had dismissed as insignificant now reframed through a lens of consequence. Meanwhile, Emily sat on the floor long after the television had gone silent, rocking the boys gently as her own thoughts spiraled. She had known this moment might come one day, but never like this, never with such brutal exposure. Fear pressed against her resolve, mingled with guilt for the secrecy she had maintained and an aching concern for how this revelation would affect her children. Yet beneath the panic lay a strange sense of inevitability, as though the truth had simply chosen its own moment to emerge. Across the city, Alexander finally stood, pushing aside the polished image he had worn for years. The press conference that had begun as another calculated step in his public journey had become a turning point he could not retreat from. He understood that whatever followed would demand honesty rather than control, presence rather than distance. In a single, unguarded question spoken by a 4-year-old child, his carefully constructed world had cracked open, revealing a path forward that was as terrifying as it was unavoidable. 2 days passed in a haze of unanswered questions and restless nights before Alexander finally stood on the narrow porch of Emily's house. He had arrived alone, deliberately leaving behind the layers of protection that usually surrounded him. There were no assistants waiting in the car, no security scanning the street, no cameras documenting the moment. For the first time in years, he felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with reputation and everything to do with fear of rejection. He hesitated before knocking, aware that this door separated his former life from a reality he was only beginning to comprehend. Emily opened the door slowly, her expression guarded but composed. The exhaustion in her eyes told a story of sleepless nights and emotional strain, yet she did not step back immediately to invite him in. For a brief moment, they simply looked at each other, measuring how much had changed and how much remained painfully familiar. Alexander spoke first, his voice controlled but tense, accusing her of taking 4 years away from him, of denying him the chance to know his own children. The words carried frustration, but beneath them lay something far more fragile. Emily listened without interrupting, absorbing his anger as calmly as she could. When she finally responded, her voice was quiet but steady, reminding him that she had not acted out of cruelty but out of protection. She told him that she had feared he would always choose ambition over presence, and that her greatest responsibility had been to ensure her sons never felt like an inconvenience. The truth settled heavily between them, forcing Alexander to confront a version of himself he could not easily dismiss. Inside the house, Lucas and Noah watched silently from the hallway, their identical faces reflecting uncertainty and curiosity. Lucas remained half-hidden behind the wall, instinctively cautious, while Noah stepped forward with open interest, studying Alexander with the same fearless curiosity that had carried his voice across a live broadcast. When Noah asked if Alexander was really their father, the question landed with a sincerity that stripped away every defense Alexander had left. He lowered himself to their level, ignoring the unfamiliar ache in his knees, and met their eyes directly. He told them that he had only just learned about them, that he was shocked, and that he wanted to understand who they were if they would allow him the chance. His words were careful, free of promises he was not yet sure how to keep, yet honest in a way that surprised even him. Lucas watched intently, searching for certainty, while Noah accepted the explanation with simple openness. Emily observed the exchange closely, ready to intervene if necessary, but she did not pull the boys away. She saw something in Alexander's posture and tone that she had not seen before, uncertainty mixed with genuine effort. Still, she made her boundaries clear, explaining that any role in their lives would require patience, consistency, and respect for the stability she had built. This was not a negotiation she intended to lose, because her children's sense of safety came before everything else. Alexander agreed without hesitation, understanding that trust could not be demanded or accelerated. As he left later that evening, the weight he carried felt different from the one that had followed him since the press conference. It was heavier in responsibility, yet lighter in confusion. For the first time, the future no longer revolved solely around strategy and control, but around the possibility of becoming someone worthy of the title he had only just been offered. The weeks that followed were marked by careful steps rather than dramatic gestures, as though every movement required deliberation and restraint. Alexander reorganized his life in ways that surprised those who worked most closely with him, declining invitations that once would have been unquestionable and delegating responsibilities he had always insisted on controlling personally. Flights were rescheduled, meetings shortened, and late nights at the office gradually replaced with early mornings that began in a quiet suburban neighborhood rather than a high-rise apartment. Each adjustment felt unfamiliar, yet necessary, as if he were learning to inhabit a version of himself that had long been neglected. Emily maintained a measured distance, neither welcoming nor rejecting his efforts outright. She insisted on clear routines and predictable visits, explaining that her sons needed consistency more than enthusiasm. Alexander accepted these terms without resistance, recognizing that trust would be built not through declarations but through repetition. His visits were initially brief and structured, filled with simple activities that required attention rather than authority, such as building towers from wooden blocks or reading picture books aloud in voices he felt awkward using. Lucas and Noah responded differently to his presence, reinforcing Emily's awareness of their distinct personalities. Noah adapted quickly, approaching Alexander with questions and stories that tumbled out faster than he could answer them. He accepted his presence with uncomplicated curiosity, as though adding a new character to an already complete world. Lucas, on the other hand, observed quietly from a distance, weighing each interaction carefully before participating. Alexander noticed the boy's caution and resisted the impulse to rush him, understanding that patience was the only language Lucas might trust. Gradually, the atmosphere shifted from formality to familiarity. Shared meals replaced scheduled visits, and Alexander learned small details that no press release could have prepared him for, such as which cereal each boy preferred and which bedtime stories frightened them. He found himself listening more than speaking, absorbing their experiences without attempting to shape them. These moments revealed a depth of fulfillment that contrasted sharply with the fleeting satisfaction of professional victories. Emily watched these changes with guarded awareness, noting the absence of arrogance that once defined Alexander's approach to life. She saw him arrive on time, sit on the floor without hesitation, and apologize sincerely when he made mistakes, however minor they seemed. Although she remained cautious, she could not ignore the evidence of genuine effort. Conversations between them became less strained, shifting toward practical cooperation rather than unresolved resentment. One evening, as the boys played quietly nearby, Emily and Alexander found themselves speaking candidly for the first time in years. They discussed fears, expectations, and the weight of decisions that had shaped their separate lives. Alexander admitted that ambition had once felt like control, and that control had seemed safer than vulnerability. Emily listened without judgment, acknowledging that fear had guided her choices as well, even when she believed she was acting purely out of strength. By the end of the evening, nothing had been formally resolved, yet something essential had begun to take shape. The boys laughed freely, unaware of the emotional negotiations unfolding around them, while the adults learned how to share space without tension. Alexander left that night with a sense of cautious hope, aware that redemption would require endurance rather than speed. The foundation being built was fragile, but it was real, and for the first time, he felt ready to protect it. Trust did not arrive suddenly or dramatically, but it began to surface in small, almost invisible moments that gradually reshaped the rhythm of their lives. Alexander's visits were no longer marked on the calendar as events that required preparation. They became part of the boys' expected routine. He learned how to move through their world quietly, respecting the balance Emily had worked so hard to maintain. The house no longer felt tense when he entered, and the silence that once followed him was replaced by ordinary sounds of life continuing as usual. Lucas remained cautious, but his watchfulness slowly softened into curiosity. One afternoon, while Noah eagerly showed Alexander a new drawing, Lucas lingered nearby, pretending to focus on his toys while listening closely to every word. Alexander noticed the hesitation and resisted the urge to force connection. Instead, he sat on the floor and began assembling a puzzle alone, leaving space rather than filling it. After several minutes, Lucas joined him without comment, fitting a piece into place with quiet concentration. The absence of pressure mattered more than reassurance ever could. That evening, as the boys prepared for bed, Lucas surprised everyone by choosing Alexander to read the story. His voice was hesitant but deliberate, and when Alexander accepted without visible emotion, Emily felt something shift inside her. She watched from the doorway as he read slowly, stumbling over character voices but never rushing, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. When the story ended, Lucas asked a question that carried more weight than its simple phrasing suggested. He wanted to know whether Alexander would be there again the next day. Alexander paused before answering, aware that certainty mattered more than optimism. He told him yes, not as a promise designed to comfort, but as a commitment he fully intended to honor. Lucas nodded once, absorbing the answer, and turned toward the wall as though that was enough. Emily stood quietly, realizing that trust was being granted in increments, each one earned rather than assumed. Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Emily and Alexander sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table, the space between them filled with unspoken reflection rather than tension. She acknowledged that the boys were beginning to feel safe with him, a statement that carried both relief and vulnerability. Alexander responded with humility, admitting that he was still learning how to be present without control, how to show up without expecting immediate reward. Their conversation drifted toward the future, not in terms of reconciliation, but in shared responsibility. As weeks passed, Alexander's priorities continued to shift. He began leaving meetings early without apology and declined public appearances that conflicted with family commitments. The professional world adjusted without collapsing, forcing him to recognize how much of his former urgency had been self-imposed. The realization was unsettling, yet freeing, because it allowed him to redefine success beyond public validation. One quiet afternoon, while the boys played in the yard, Lucas approached Alexander on his own and asked whether he planned to leave again someday. The question was asked without accusation, but its importance was unmistakable. Alexander answered honestly, saying that he could not change the past, but he could choose differently now. He explained that staying required effort, and that effort was something he was willing to give. Lucas considered this carefully, then nodded, accepting the answer not as certainty, but as sincerity. Emily watched the exchange from the window, understanding that the past had not been erased, but it was no longer dictating the present. The distance between fear and hope had narrowed, replaced by cautious belief. Love had not yet reclaimed its place, but respect had, and for the first time, the possibility of something lasting no longer felt impossible. Nearly a year after the moment that had exposed the truth to the world, Alexander stood once again before a row of cameras, but this time the atmosphere felt entirely different. The conference hall was quieter, stripped of unnecessary spectacle, and the questions prepared by journalists seemed almost secondary to what he intended to say. He no longer felt the familiar tension of performance, because there was nothing left to protect behind polished words. The life he once guarded so carefully had already been reshaped beyond recognition. Emily sat several rows back, watching him with calm attentiveness rather than anxiety. The distance between them was no longer defined by fear or resentment, but by a shared understanding earned through time and consistency. At her side, Lucas and Noah swung their legs slightly, whispering to each other and occasionally glancing up at the stage. They looked comfortable, secure, and entirely unconcerned with the significance of the moment unfolding around them, which in itself felt like a quiet victory. When Alexander spoke, his voice carried a steadiness rooted not in control, but in acceptance. He addressed the past openly, acknowledging mistakes without deflection and responsibility without excuses. He spoke about growth, about learning that presence mattered more than perfection, and that success lost its meaning when it was disconnected from human bonds. There was no dramatic confession, only clarity shaped by experience. At the end of the conference, he stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward the boys. Noah reached for his hand without hesitation, while Lucas followed more slowly, though with visible confidence. Alexander felt the simple weight of their trust settle into him, grounding him more effectively than any applause ever had. The cameras captured the moment, but for once, he did not notice. Later that afternoon, they gathered in a nearby park, away from public attention and expectations. The boys ran freely across the grass, their laughter filling the open space, while Emily and Alexander sat side by side on a bench, sharing the quiet comfort of familiarity. The past no longer hovered between them as an unresolved burden. It had become a shared history they could acknowledge without pain. Alexander turned to her then, not with rehearsed words or grand promises, but with honesty shaped by humility. He told her that he no longer wanted to live a life divided into priorities that excluded what mattered most. He admitted that love had frightened him when it demanded sacrifice, and that he had confused independence with distance. What he offered now was not certainty, but commitment grounded in action rather than intention. Emily listened carefully, searching his face for traces of the man she once left behind. What she saw instead was someone changed not by loss alone, but by responsibility willingly embraced. She did not rush her answer, because she understood that healing did not require urgency. When she finally spoke, it was with quiet confidence, acknowledging that while trust could not be rebuilt overnight, it had already begun. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, Lucas and Noah returned, settling between them as naturally as if it had always been this way. In that moment, Alexander understood that redemption was not a single act, but a continuous choice made daily. The world he once believed he needed to conquer had narrowed into something smaller, more fragile, and infinitely more meaningful. What began with secrecy and fear had found its ending in truth, patience, and a family finally allowed to exist in the open. To me, this story is about truth always finding its way out, even when it is hidden out of fear. Silence may feel like protection at first, but over time it becomes a burden. Alexander and Emily are neither heroes nor villains. They are human beings shaped by fear and difficult choices. What matters most is that real change here does not come from dramatic speeches, but from daily responsibility, patience, and the willingness to stay when it would be easier to walk away. If telling the truth could destroy the life you know but create the life you truly need, would you have the courage to say it out loud? This story is entirely fictional and created by the author of the channel. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental.